Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the latest edition of Building the Scottish State with myself, Dr. Mark McNaught, here on the 9th of December, 2021. Hoping everybody is getting ready for their holidays and have done all their Christmas shopping, such as it is at this point. But I have the great pleasure to have with me again a regular Alf Baird, who is here to talk about a framework for Scottish independence. But first of all, Alf, thank you for being with us.
Hello, Mark. Nice to see you again.
Just to remind you, for our viewers, just remind us who you are and kind of what a brief biography.
Yeah, I started off with working in shipping in Leith, running shipping lines, services all over Europe and some agencies for global markets, Latin America, South Africa, and so on. And I then did a few other things and had a couple of businesses and decided to do a degree in business studies and become a researcher in business studies and shipping mainly, and did a PhD in shipping at Edinburgh Napier, and then eventually became lecturer, senior lecturer, director of a research group, and finally professor back in 2005 of professor of maritime business.
Okay.
I think that's the only professor of maritime business in Scotland, if not Britain, I don't know. But that's pretty much me. So my background is pretty much shipping, trade, and global trade. My PhD is pretty much in global strategy.
Okay. And what university do you teach at?
That's Edinburgh Napier.
Napier. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. So first of all, we're gonna be discussing in a few minutes the socio-political determinants of Scottish independence, if you laid them out. But first of all, I wanted just to, because you have people that don't believe that Scotland is a colony, and the idea that there was a treaty signed, it was voluntary, and obviously there's many people that take issue with this. But how, in what sense is Scotland a colony, and what would decolonization mean in terms of achieving independence?
Well, I should mention the background a wee bit to the book and to the research. My background is also dealing in theoretical frameworks and developing theoretical frameworks. So that's what I try to do with Scottish independence, mainly because most of the arguments for and against Scottish independence tended to be about the economy, about things like pensions, defence, and so on. But when I was getting into the research of this, I found that really it wasn't to do with many of these things at all. It was to do with a whole range of other aspects. As I ground out the data from the research that I was doing, looking at the research, and it's a theoretical framework based on theory. So it's developed from existing published works in a whole range of areas. So it actually got down to several key dimensions, including colonialism, but starting off, first of all, in cultural and linguistic aspects. It's also to do with institutions. It's to do, as you know, with the Constitution. It's to do with self-determination. It's to do with other political ideologies, things like nationalism and so on, and also to some extent ethnicity. So when I was looking at this in some detail and taking the data and published works on independence globally, it drives you towards colonialism. And when you think about it, all the states who have left the UK or England as a core have decolonized. And even Ireland, according to the UN, has decolonized in that sense. So you then have to ask yourself the fundamental question, why is Scotland any different? And when you probe into the deeper characteristics of imperialism, colonialism, you then get into the realms of cultural imperialism, of linguistic imperialism, and these aspects. And Scotland fits very tidily into these areas. You have to remember also that colonialism means many different things. It's not just a case of political and economic exploitation. And I don't think we can disagree that that's been the case with Scotland. But it's not just that. It's also about the colonial mindset. It's also about culture. It's also about language. And that forms our national identity. So it's also about national identity and emotions to do with that. So colonialism is quite a wide range of things that comes from these other aspects.
And how would you distinguish colonialism from imperialism?
Well, I'm not sure there's a great deal of difference
Yeah.
because the oppressions are quite similar. If we look at cultural imperialism, it's imposing a dominant culture and symbols and values on another people. Usually it's a minority group, less powerful. So Scotland fits in that dimension. But linked to this is also the fact that it's about wiping out a culture. And we know this has happened from the Gaelic experience from the 1700s, if not before, but certainly after the Culloden episode, the Gaelic culture was essentially wiped out as part of British state policy. And the people were also removed. But that clearance also continued throughout much of Scotland for that 200-year period, certainly after Culloden. And Scotland lost proportionately more of its people than any other Western European country. Between 3 and 4 million people left Scotland after the Union. So we've lost a great number of people. The culture, certainly the Gaelic culture, was pretty much removed from the Highlands and Islands. But the Scots culture, we have to remember that the Scots language is distinct on its own, but it's never been taught. And educationalists in the British sense, trying to impose a British culture on Scotland to make this a one nation ideology, if you like, intentionally don't teach the Scots language. Because Scots language and culture is what gives people their national consciousness in colonialism, as they say. National consciousness, national identity is built on these foundations of culture and language. So we don't have our Scots language. We didn't teach our bairns how to speak Scots in the schools. And that's largely explained by English or Anglophone linguists, educationalists who said historically, even back to the 1960s and 70s, that Scots was not a valid language. Now, when you say a language is not a valid language of an ethnic minority in the Scottish sense, in the British sense, the Scots, then you're basically saying the people who speak it are not valid either. Then we get into the realms of what colonialism fundamentally is, and imperialism too. It's about imposing a superior culture on a people. Now, that superior culture is based also on language, and the message comes in language. And that's what brings you into the aspects of colonialism, which is actually racism in the post-colonial literature. It tells you that imposing of superior cultural hegemony, which you'll know the theory of Gramsci and so on, we then get into the realms of cultural hegemony, cultural imperialism, linguistic imperialism, and then linguicide, the genocide of a language, the death of a language, which was the intention with the Gaelic language, but has also been the intention with the Scots language, to marginalize it, to marginalize the speakers, not to give it any credibility or status, not to teach it. And if you don't teach a language, the people don't learn it properly, and then they come to regard it as inferior. And that brings us into the colonial mindset, which is a people then regard their own culture and language as inferior. And that's the objective of cultural imperialism.
And tell me a little bit about the Scots language. I mean, it shares a lot of words with English, right? But just tell me a little bit about the Scots language.
Well, there's a lovely wee dictionary, but really, there's so much in the Scots language. I think you probably have to go back to Pictish times to see the real origins of the Scots language. And certainly the Picts spoke a different language from the Gaels in Dalriada and Argyll. So the Gaelic language was quite different. There was a bit of a merger around about post-Viking times. But the Scots, the Picts basically were most of Scotland, if you like. Over that mountainous divide on the west coast was the Dalriada Scots who spoke a Gaelic, slightly different Gaelic from the Irish. So most of the Scots spoke a different language. Now, we could go back even further. The historic compulsory foe, if you like, of the Scots or the Picts was the Britae. Subsequently, the Romans, eventually the Vikings. But in between that time, round about the 10th century, you have that merger of the Picts and the Scots, Dalriada, Gaelic speakers. And that's the creation of the new Scotland. The Scots language developed from that period, largely through medieval times, through trade internationally. 2/3 of the population, remember, Mark, in Scotland was on the east coast mostly, or the central belt between Clyde and Forth. So not the Highlands and Islands, but 2/3 of the population was typically before 1700s in that area. And the Scots language developed very well. There's a vast literature there that people, Billy Kay and many others have written about very eloquently about Scottish literature and culture. The difficulty we had then, of course, is the Union of the Crown in 1603 brought forth a Scottish king in England who became, if you like, anglicised. And we then get into Professor Tom Devine's excellent work about Scottish history, which the aristocracy and the nobility became more English, married into English families, took English estates, English titles, and became English, if you like, from 1603 onwards. So a lot of the Scottish nobility became pretty much English. The Scots themselves as a people remained Scots, or on the northern side, on the Highlands and Islands, still retained Gaelic culture and language. So we had these two languages, but we had an elite aristocracy that was becoming English. And by the time of the 1707 Union, they were more or less mostly English, the aristocracy. And so they were probably relatively easy to bribe to sell the sovereignty of the people. And that's exactly what happened. Then you get post-Culloden, of course, and all the Jacobite lands were confiscated, and the Jacobite nobility and many others were sent off to the colonies, or worse. Lands were confiscated.
And tell me a little bit about the Battle of Culloden. What year was it, and what did it signify?
I'm not a historian. I only know that it was, I think, 1746. I grew up in Edinburgh in a place called Duddingston Village, where we had a stables there, which had a skittle alley, and I worked in the skittles, lifting the skittles up at night in this old pub called the Sheep's Head, and it was reputed to be where an English spy was hung in these stables before the Battle of Preston Pans during the 1745 rebellion. So, but apart from that, I don't know a great deal about it. But the Culloden, of course, after that, the Highlands, the Gaelic community was largely, to a large extent, intentionally destroyed and cleared from the lands, from Sutherland and from other places. And quite a lot of the Jacobite sympathizers had their lands confiscated by the British Crown. And these were obviously Scots and Gaels. My own family from Aberdeenshire lost lands during that forfeiture. So I could have been very rich. but our lands were also confiscated after Culloden.
The 16th of April, 1746.
1746 was the bad day. But essentially, it's been regarded as ethnic cleansing, because many thousands of people were cleared from the land. But as I said to you, that didn't stop after the 1746. It continued on to the 1800s and also the 1900s. I think the largest out-migration from Scotland was between the 1880s and the 1930s. And it was 8 or 9 times more than the emigration from England. So something was going on to move people out. And this is also a feature of colonialism and imperialism, to move people out and also to impose a culture and a language on a people. So Scots are essentially bilingual. We have colonial bilingualism, either Scots and English or Gaelic, Scots and English. Well, there's 3. But essentially, that's quite a complex area. And that gets us back to what I found in the research is that independence, even the UN tell you independence is about decolonization, mainly. And it's related to these aspects of cultural and linguistic imperialism, which are always features of imperialism and colonialism, whether it's Russia, whether it's Austro-Hungarian Empire, whether it's England, it's all the same.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's turn our attention now, Paul. If you could put up the framework that on the screen of the socio-political determinants of Scottish independence. So walk us through that, and then if we need to take it down, I'll ask Paul to take it down.
Well, just very quickly, culture. I've mentioned cultural imperialism, cultural hegemony. Various other theories apply here to Scotland. Language. Linguistic imperialism is a well-known theory. Linguistic language subordination, these things. But the fact is that Scots language isn't taught, and that's an intentional aspect. That's a key feature of colonialism for natives, if you like, to cast off their own culture and language in favor of a superior or a supposedly superior culture and language. We then get to demographics, and it's people that vote after all. The demographics of Scotland since the Union has been, if you look at the historical census, has been largely out-migration of Scots, and inbound is mainly a meritocracy from England. And here we also have to remember that people get jobs, especially the top jobs. Language has to be English. Scots language, there's no requirement unless you want to work for the Gaelic language regulator. Then I think they do have a stipulation you have to speak Gaelic, but there's no Scots language stipulation in Scotland, as there is in many other Nordic countries like Norway, Finland, and so on. You would have to speak the national language as well as English. But the other aspect of demographics, of course, is that for many, many years, all the top jobs in Scotland are advertised in the London metropolitan press. So they're targeted at a much wider market than Scotland. And that's why our meritocracy tends to be very heavily Anglophone and not necessarily Scots. Then we get into colonialism. Now, there's various aspects of colonialism, but the definition of colonialism is quite straightforward. It's external political control of a territory, and I think we can safely say that the majority of MPs in England can do pretty much what they like with Scotland. Yeah. The second feature is the territory is economically exploited and plundered. And I think there's a great deal of evidence that Scotland's resources have been plundered and exploited. And also Scotland's economy is not as well developed as it could be. We talked earlier about ports and shipping. Our trade is very, very limited. We also have most of our trade is oriented to serving the core nation. And that's a feature of what's known as internal colonialism. And internal colonialism has two main aspects, which is, first of all, there's a cultural division of labour, which favours the dominant culture, which is Anglophone. And second feature is the economy of the internal colony, if you like. The economy is basically designed and set up and structured to serve the core nation or the core country. And that leads to what Scotland's had historically is a major problem, is a very narrow industrial specialisation, especially in the last century or so. A very narrow industrial specialisation leads to the economy being very susceptible to shocks. So what we've had over the last century and more, in fact, is high unemployment relative to the core nation, a poorer GDP, lower wage levels in general, and basically these are in the internal colonialism model. They are regarded as disadvantages for the peripheral territory in that sense. We then get to nationalism, and in looking at the theories of nationalism, there's many different types of nationalism, as you probably know, but the one that Scottish independence is not about nationalism as such, as it's more so about national consciousness, which comes from the first two dimensions in the framework here, culture and language, gives us our national consciousness, national identity. Without that, there's no desire for independence of any people. There's no desire for nationhood if you don't have your own culture and language. So we still have the what's called in colonialism the dregs of culture. We're at the rock bottom. We've got a moribund culture and a rusted tongue. Our language, our language is almost gone because we don't teach it. And that's a feature of the colonialism and imperialism we're subject to. that we want to independence from. So essentially, our nationalism is actually self-determination nationalism. British nationalism, on the other hand, which is the Union, is what's known as transnational nationalism.
Yeah,
that's about imposing a superior, as you like, or a dominant culture, language, military force, whatever, on another people, and that's an aggressive kind of nationalism. But it's basically what we might define as the Tory one nation Britain, one nation Britain policy. It's basically transnational nationalism. Whereas Scottish nationalism is not really nationalism; it's more national consciousness and a desire for independence to overcome these other aspects of inequality, if you like, because colonialism and imperialism is always about inequality, because the native will always be subordinate in that situation, and that's where we are with high levels of poverty, a poor economy, and not competitive globally. So that's our situation. We then move to institutions.
Just before we move on about nationalism, I mean, Scottish nationalism has been characterized as kind of a civic nationalism by the SNP and others, saying, we don't care where you're from, we don't care what accent you have. If if you live here and you want to be Scottish, you're Scottish. And do you see it that way? How would you interpret that vision of nationalism? And is it
civic nationalism is a pretty new concept. What it depends on fundamentally is that the people that aspire to civic nationalism have a sense of belonging to that country. So these are people from other countries who come to, say, Scotland and have a sense of belonging to Scotland and wanting the citizenship of that country. The problem we have pre-independence is we can't offer citizenship to them. The other problem is people who vote no don't want a sense of belonging to that country. People who vote no are denying citizenship, not just to people that want to live here, but to Scots themselves, which in a sense is xenophobic. but so what my analysis in the book on this includes the civic nationalism, which it concludes that it's premature and it doesn't really apply in this case. Of course, people would be welcome to stay in Scotland and be citizens of Scotland once it's independent, but only after independence can we offer citizenship. So it's relatively immature. It's relatively premature at the moment. Do you want me to continue with institutions?
Go around the clock.
Well, institutions, if we go back to the colonial reality, the culture, the linguistic imperialism, and how colonialism and exploitation fit together, and a culture and language is subordinated, we then get to the reality that institutions are also colonial in nature. And in this, it means that a country that's in a colonial environment, its institutions are also colonial administration.
Including the Scottish government.
Well, it starts from the Scottish government, but even the British government, it's all British civil servants, and British civil servants are sent to run Scotland in the Scottish government. But all the institutions of state are basically run in a kind of colonial environment, because their allegiance is to the state, the British state. The Crown. So it doesn't really matter which institution they are. You could even talk about the justice system, the education system. I've just been talking about education in the sense of language, and the fact the Scots language the Scots are deprived of learning their own language, which I should say has been a policy of the European Council for many years. Have been trying to get the Scottish government, British government, to teach the Scots language as a minority language within the UK. And they've done that for the Gaelic language because they did that for the Gaelic language, I assume, and created a regulatory body and brought out qualifications in Gaelic and the Gaelic television and £50 million a year. The government did that because it wasn't a political threat to the UK Union. There was only 50,000 speakers of Gaelic. So it's a bit of a mystification policy. why they've not done the same for the Scots language pro rata, given that still almost probably nearly 2 million people still speak Scots.
Okay, I was just going to ask that how many people, what the number of people, and to what extent it's still a very much a living language, because I live in Brittany, and apparently just before the Second World War, Breton there were more Breton speakers than there were Welsh speakers, but then after the war there was pretty systematic language repression to the extent where kids would be punished if they spoke Breton at school, that type of thing, the real repression. And so
I was brought up in school in the 60s, and we had the same linguistic oppression then. We weren't allowed to say Scots words, and this it gives people a false persona, and it's a psychological effect as well. The colonial mindset. In colonial literature, the colonial mindset is regarded as a disease of the mind, where people regard their own culture and language as inferior. Yeah. And they're told to regard it as inferior by the dominant force, the nationalist or the imperial power that tells them. And we get this in the BBC every day. Yeah. We get it on the radio every day. All the voices are Anglophone, tend to be upper class. And we've had this in films and for 50 years or more. The culture has been paraded in that sense, and the stereotype of the Scots language. The stereotypes are all there as well. That's all part of the same process. So that's basically institutions, if you like. Of course, in a colonial environment, your institutions are also colonial, and they don't always work in the interests of the people. We then get to constitution, and of course all about the treaty. The treaty is a treaty between two nations. The Scots are sovereign, and in my analysis of the theory on that and the literature is, of course, that the international courts regard any signatory party to a treaty as having the ability to withdraw from that treaty. Yeah, and the Scots should be no different. In addition to that, we already have recognition that the Scots are a sovereign people. Yeah. So therefore, the political representatives, as the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, have written to all MPs and MSPs that they should use the treaty and use the sovereignty of the people to withdraw Scotland from the treaty because of the violations. Yeah, and you're perfectly correct about that. I don't know if you want to add something to that about the Constitution, Mark.
Oh no, that's fine for now. Go ahead and go.
But the ethnicity is a bit of a hot potato in many cases. But the two aspects of ethnicity, going back to the psychology of colonialism, it works in different ways. But first and foremost is colonialism involves racism. It's about making one culture and language and values and symbols superior to another. So it's about diminishing, in this case, the Scots culture and Scots language. That also affects inequality, as it were. And you then have within that system a socio-linguistic prejudice. So the socio-linguistic prejudice, the hegemony is, of course, Anglophone. The meritocracy is Anglophone. So all the institutions in Scotland are basically Anglophone dominated. And because a lot of the higher level posts are advertised in the metropolitan centre in London press, then a lot of the people who fill these positions come in from outside Scotland. Yeah, I did a very detailed analysis of Scottish universities in this because I come from quite a few decades in a Scottish university, so I was able to analyse it in some detail. And what I found was quite amazing that out of in terms of the elite universities in Scotland, up to 90% of the academics were not Scottish. Yeah. Only 10% were Scottish, and I actually found a few departments that had no Scottish academics whatsoever. Now, I had taught in Norway for 10, 15 years, every year in a master's degree, and I found the opposite there. 90% of the academics or more were Norwegian. Yeah. in the university. Only 10% were from international backgrounds. And quite often they were visiting professors. They weren't given full-time jobs in the Norwegian university. Mm-hmm. So they had their policy was very much in favor of the indigenous people. Yeah. Which quite rightly so. So what I found was this wasn't just about academics. It also filtered down into PhD students.
Sure.
So most of the PhD students in Scottish universities are not Scots either. And this means your future academic cohort, your future professors in Scotland are not going to be Scots either.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as the elite universities in Scotland have internationalized, you know, they've forgotten that they're also there to help the Scottish people become intellectually aware and do all the things that academics around the world do. But so the Scots in the academic sense are marginalized. This is also the case at higher levels. Out of the 19 higher education institutions in Scotland, I think only 2 are run by Scots.
Jeez.
So at the senior level, at the professorial level, and even at the academic level, Scots are marginalized from their own learning institutions.
Yeah, their own universities. Yeah, exactly.
Their own, and this is why, in my view, we get such a limited literature on independence coming out of universities in Scotland.
Yeah. Yeah,
I remember there's not a lot coming out.
I know. Well, I found that mind-blowing when I was, because
it is. We're talking about the future of our country.
I know.
But most of the academics are not Scots.
Back in 2011, when I first started getting interested in, in Scottish independence and started writing for Newsnet, I mean, it was almost like I had the field to myself. I was like, wait, why isn't there more stuff from, university studies about a constitution? I mean,
that's right.
There was practically nothing.
The academics that quite often are commenting on Scotland are not Scots.
Yeah. And
maybe have less awareness of the culture and linguistic aspects, or, in terms of national identity and so on. The impetus, the requirement for liberty in that sense, because at the end of the day, independence is also about liberty and freedom, freedom for a culture and language to live and survive and develop, freedom and liberty for a people to develop and a nation to develop, not to just be there to serve a core nation 400 miles away with the metropolitan core, and that's really where we are at the moment. And the last dimension here is self-determination.
But before we get on to that, I wanted to address the issue of ethnicity. And
there's one other aspect on ethnicity I need to talk about.
I wanted to talk about the franchise okay, because I had an interview with Gordon McIntyre Kemp the other day, and I was evoking. He was saying, "Oh well, these certain people don't want English people to vote, and they want it to be this kind of blood and soil." That's not his words, but you know what I mean. It was like the idea. He would say, "Well, I have English origins, or I have a grandfather, whatever, that was English, and and I wouldn't want to exclude them." And I know that it was a little bit. I know that your arguments have been more nuanced and said, well, look, we don't want. There's been a major demographic shift especially over the last few years. There's been a lot of English people moving in, and also so the question of should there be a certain amount of residency? The fact that as you pointed out, you're using the local election voter lists for any type of vote, and so flesh that out a little bit. I mean, because I know that it's not like, oh, we don't want English people to vote, but I living in France, I wouldn't expect to have a vote. I mean, but in France, for example, back when the UK was in the EU and I have UK citizenship, I was able to vote at European elections and local elections, but constitutional things were reserved for, whether it was the president or the Assemblée Nationale, that was only French people could vote for that, which I totally understand. How do you see that with Scotland, and especially since if there is another referendum in whatever form, what do you think should be the parameters of the franchise regarding ethnicity?
Well, the first thing when I was doing this, I did analyze quite a lot of other countries and what they did with referendums and national elections. And the first thing that became very obvious is that Scotland's government was using a local government franchise for national elections and referendum, which was a big mistake, obviously, because that's highly irregular. A local government franchise is based on residence. So any resident, whether they're coming in to be a student, or just as you mentioned in another program, I think to Gordon, was the military, or people passing through for a year or two, they could vote on Scotland's sovereignty. And this, of course, wouldn't happen in any other country. You have to be a national of that country to have a vote in a national referendum or national elections. The problem arises because the referendum is run under the Scottish government at Holyrood, which is a devolved arrangement and has basically the same equivalence of a local authority or regional authority, according to Westminster. So when it was set up, it was given a local government franchise because that's how they regard it. Yeah. Although it can pass acts that then have to be passed, okayed by London, it's a pseudo parliament. It's not the real McCoy. And we know that in terms of sovereignty. So we've ended up with this local government franchise for a referendum. The problem with that is if we go back to the demographics, Scotland's demographics are fundamentally changing. And it's the next census it's been delayed for another year, but it will show that probably there's well over 1 million people that are not Scots that will be able to vote on Scottish sovereignty. And what we found in the post-referendum research that Edinburgh University did back in 2014 and 2015 was that that's the group that has the highest propensity to vote no. So I know that there's lots of people saying that English people will vote for Scottish independence, but the reality is that most don't. And Scotland's population, as it's rapidly changing now, it's beyond. Scotland has, if you lost sovereignty or you don't control sovereignty, you don't control your borders. And that's what Scotland has a fundamental problem with, in the sense that Scotland has no control over who comes in to Scotland. Yeah. So we have no control over who votes in that sense. And with a local government franchise, anybody can come in and vote on whether Scotland exists, which is surely wrong. But I think fundamentally, though, I'm opposed to another referendum. And I think a lot of people increasingly are. For the main reason for me, though, in the research I found was that a referendum is not a requirement for independence. Yeah. As a matter of law, it's not a requirement. Scotland can use its sovereignty and its majorities in Parliament to dissolve the treaty, and with any number of violations. We don't have to depend on a franchise, and certainly not a local government franchise, because that's a very, very big risk. And in my view, it would be likely to be another no. And I think that's the wrong way to go. The other aspect about ethnicity that I found was that you've heard of the Scottish cultural cringe. Yes. And the reason for that is largely linguistic as well as cultural. But going back to culture and language as forming national identity is because our language is regarded as inferior in the UK context. The Scots language and culture is regarded in that context as inferior. Then the Scots have developed this, what's called the Scottish cultural cringe, which is also known as appropriated racial oppression. It's also known as internalized racism, and it's about a people who accept their the lack of opportunities, their poverty, their deprivation, their inequality. They accept all that as being deserved. In fact, they might even accept things like wars and clearances as being deserved. So that's part of the colonial mindset, as it were, in that sense. And this is quite a serious condition psychologically. Yeah. It's very, very difficult to change. But essentially, in the post-colonial literature, it tells you that independence, people to become independent, have to cast off that mindset. And that's a very difficult concept, because the post-colonial theorists tell us that's a disease of the mind. So in a sense, although we can talk about economics and how better off or worse off Scots people would be, there's other aspects here at play, and a colonial mindset shouldn't be downplayed. If your country is treated as, and your people are treated as a subordinate and as a colony, literally, and oppressed in that sense and exploited, then there is another effect, and it's a psychological effect, and that's probably one of the most important features of people voting against their own liberation. Mm-hmm. So Scots voting against independence, you could hypothesize, have higher levels of appropriated racial oppression. Mm-hmm. And that's the same for any oppressed group in that sense.
Okay. All right. Paul, could you put the chart back up, please? Here we go. So on to self-determination.
Yeah, well, self-determination, I think we then get into the fact that it is a cardinal principle in international law that the other thing, I think that colonial peoples can become independent, and that's a policy of the UN, of course. They see colonialism as a scourge, which is a form of punishment and should be ended. So the UN is generally supportive of that, and they have a committee for that purpose, the C24, which, as you probably know, is actually called the Decolonization Committee. So that committee is there to be used for peoples that are in self-determination conflict. The other aspect about self-determination conflict peoples is very often they are linguistically divided. And we saw this even in the respect of Quebec, and I think to some extent also Catalonia. But yes, globally, around the world, historically, peoples in self-determination conflict are often linguistically and indeed culturally divided. And that includes even places like Finland, casting off the Russians in 1917, rather. And largely the key thing that distinguished them was their language. Poland as well. Poland has been oppressed in both sides, and east and west and south, I think. At one time, the Germans, the Russians at east side, and then Austro-Hungarians from the south, trying to remove their language and culture. So these things are not uncommon. They're well known. The thing about the UN, of course, in decolonization is that peoples have a right to independence in that sense under the international law for decolonization. But so that's another area that can be used if the treaty route is prevented. Mm-hmm. We have to remember also that fundamentally colonialism is force. So at the moment we've been forced out of the EU, Scotland. We've also been forced to remain, or not to have an independence referendum, where we've had several mandates now to have another referendum, but that's been refused anyway. Mm-hmm. So Scotland, in a sense, is already being held by force. And I think there's a lot of examples, a lot of illustrations at the moment, the political illustrations of what's happening, that shows we are actually in the decolonization phase, Mark. Mm-hmm. So if we are a colony, we have to live with this reality of cultural and linguistic oppression in a sense, but all these other aspects, institutional and so on, and this transnational nationalism, we're held under this ideology of the British one nation. So we're already in there in the throes of decolonization. We then have to figure out where in that process we are.
Yeah, and how? Explain more about that. I mean, you could say that. Well, there was the referendum in 2014. It didn't, for whatever reason, it didn't. The Scots voted no, and then so I mean, the idea is maybe we're stuck, and we're not. Scotland is not moving towards independence or decolonization. In what sense do you see that Scotland is in the process of decolonization?
Well, the post-colonial literature is quite clear on what happens here, whether you read Memmi, Fanon, and Césaire and so on, that what happens when you have a dominant national party is the dominant national party very often makes its own accommodation with colonialism, with the colonial power. And then they then become more a colonial administration. And I think that's where the S1.EP have got to. Yep. They become that. And then
Paul, if you could take down the photo, please.
Yeah, so that post-colonial reality tells us where we go. If you have a dominant national party, it reaches that accommodation and settles in, if you like.
Yeah.
And it actually tells you what they do is they feather their nests, they delay independence, they attack independence campaigners, and they use even the forces of the colonial power to do so. And we saw that in the case of Mr. Salmond.
Yeah,
and also Craig Murray.
Craig Murray, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And several others. I think there's been about 10 different cases. So we saw that happening. This is all part of the post-colonial template. It tells us that's the decolonization process. What happens then is new national parties are created, like ALBA and the other parties. They're created. This is all part of the process. Then what the people obviously are very unhappy because they've put their faith in the dominant national party. The dominant national party has let them down stinking. They've not moved independence one bit in the last 7 years. And they're actually look as if they're trading away Scotland's sovereignty. And Scotland's sovereignty, in a sense, with uncontrolled borders and demographic change, Scotland's sovereignty is leaking every day in that sense. So you have to be careful. The issue about decolonization is important as well, because so long as the territory is under colonial authority, it will eventually perish if it doesn't move, because its culture, its language, other aspects of its nationhood are eroding all the time. They're eroding all the time. And we see no effort, for example, to teach the Scots language to Scots bairns. They might learn words like bairns or heed or hoose or dug or elbe or lug. They might learn all sorts of wonderful words, but that would give them the culture and the aspects of nationhood that are very important. And without the language of a people, the people and the culture, they no longer exist. And that's why they're perishable. They perish. So the nation, so long as this continues, will not be good. And also, of course, people would not be happy, because there is at the moment, or seems to be, virtually a majority in favour. The other thing about going back to the self-determination thing is the two aspects that I should have mentioned. One is the definition of a people is very important. Because the definition of a people, what in self-determination, it means the self-determination of a distinct people, and that people are usually defined by a common culture, common language, heritage, common suffering, and ethnicity, a common ethnicity. I mean, we shouldn't be embarrassed about it. People are indigenous. The indigenous Scot exists, and they speak Scots usually, unless they've cast off their tongue. So self-determination is about a people, even more so than a place. People might not have a place, but they might still be a distinct ethnic people, and they have a right to self-determination. The second factor important to remember in self-determination or independence as a whole is it should not be subject to external interference. And external interference includes peoples from other countries. They have no place in the game here. This is about self-determination of a distinct people. And in this case, it's the Scots people. And that's what the self-determination process tells you, the theory tells you, and the UN. It's about a distinct, defined people. It's not about everybody that wants to come here and study, philosophy or live in the Highlands rather than, deepest Sussex. So it's about a distinct people. It shouldn't be subject to external interference, and that external interference includes the media and government. Absolutely. And this is where the 2014 referendum was completely unfair, because there was just an onslaught with the British media and the British government using everything they could to throw at independence, against independence. So that's why it was an unfair process. They should have butted out, basically, because independence, self-determination is about a distinct people, their country, if it exists. It's nothing to do with other peoples, other countries. and even in the independence referendum in 2014, we had trainloads of Labour MPs coming up to Glasgow, telling people to vote no.
Yeah.
We had loads of visits from David Cameron and George Osborne and ministers telling people to vote no. We had businesses from London coming up saying,
or else vote no, or else.
Yeah. So it was just a constant barrage of negativity and interference in self-determination. So if you were having any self-determination referendum or even plebiscite election, these people shouldn't be involved. People from other countries should not be involved. That is the international reality. That is the theory on self-determination. It's about a distinct people.
Okay, and if there was to be another referendum, and you were able to, enact this, what do you think would be the policy of that with regard to registration, with regard to residency? How would you do that? If there was to be an actual referendum.
Well, I think the example in New Caledonia is very interesting because what New Caledonia, which is a French territory trying to get independence, what they've done is they've introduced a whole range of secondary criteria. So that includes length of residence in the territory. Yeah. If you're over 20 years there, fine, you can get a vote. If you have parental descent, you can get a vote. But if you turn up in the last couple of years, you can't expect a vote on their sovereignty and their independence. So that secondary criteria referendum has been agreed with the UN. Yeah. So there's precedent for this. But as I say, I think a referendum is not necessarily in Scotland's best interest. And in addition, because Scotland's arrangement with England is a treaty-based alliance, Scotland has another mechanism. Yeah. A lawful mechanism, as you know, and Scotland also is already a sovereign people. Yeah. So in that sense, Scots are already independent. They just didn't ken it. They didn't ken they're independent. Yeah. But if you're sovereign, it means there's nothing above you. Yeah. Yeah. You're it. Your people are it. You're already sovereign. So we have a treaty. We have sovereignty. We don't really need a referendum. And the Scotland is perfectly at liberty to enter into agreements internationally anytime it wants. The only problem we have now is the national representatives have not delivered, and that's six national majorities, 3 at Holyrood and 3 at Westminster, who have not delivered on the sovereign wishes of the people.
Yeah. And how do you see this going forward? I mean, because, given, Boris Johnson, maybe, he may have to resign. There might be another general election coming up very quickly. We just don't know. But how do you see the current state of play, given that we, our Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, made it clear to the MPs and MSPs of the pro-Indy parties that they can do exactly that, just withdraw from the treaty. There's nothing illegal about it. There's nothing, it's not as if that would be complete without precedent. But how do you see this going forward, especially with the SNP in control so dominantly in Holyrood and especially in Westminster as well?
Yeah, I think the post-colonial theory tells us what's happened with the SNP. They've made their accommodation with the colonial power, and I don't think they'll move for independence at all. So therefore, then we see new national parties coming in, and that really is the only hope now, I think, for independence. The other aspect here that's very important is for people to get an understanding of why independence is needed. And the reason I did the book and the research for the book was because I was unhappy with the explanations we were receiving from both sides of the political divide on independence. None of them were coming up with the real proper explanation of why independence was necessary and also what independence is. Yeah. So as I was getting deeper into it, I could see that independence, it's about a whole range of issues to do with inequality and oppression. And my book is called Oppressed, Dún Hodden, in Scots. But the other aspect here...
What translate Dún Hodden?
Sorry?
Translate Dún Hodden?
It means oppressed.
Oh, okay.
It means if you're hodding something dún, It's a
holding.
people.
Right.
It's in this sense, it means a people held down.
Yes, held down. Okay, all right.
It means they can't develop, they can't move.
Yeah.
They can't even enjoy their own language properly.
Yeah.
They can't develop their nation, their own people in the universities and so on. They can't develop properly. They're inhibited by another culture. And that's basically what colonialism is. It's about another culture imposing itself. And that's what transnational nationalism is, what imperialism is. It's about another culture and language and its values holding down a people, another people. So that's essentially why peoples want independence, is to overcome oppression. Yeah. It's not to have a better economy, a better government or something like that. We might get a better economy, we might not. We might get a better government, we might not. But it's not about that. And this is the fact, going back to the colonial aspects of this, colonialism is not about policies of left or right. It's not about good government or bad government. It's about liberation of the people from an oppression. And that's never changed. It's always been that way. Whether it's India, Kenya, Ireland, or Scotland, it's the same. Yeah. We just don't know it. And because of the colonial mindset, people push that argument aside as a natural instinct. But it's there. The other aspect here, just to go back, is that I think that explanation of why Scotland needs independence and what independence is has to be better explained. The narrative has to be improved in a sense. And in my view, independence is what the UN tell us it is. It's decolonization.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And then we then get to a different reality, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we need to start wrapping stuff up, but I just got a couple of questions. Who do you think would replace Boris Johnson? I saw something about Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak being potential candidates to replace Johnson. God help us if that's who knows. But I don't know if you had any if you had any view on that, or
I don't know. Maybe Donald Duck's available.
Or Donald Trump, for that matter. Who knows?
Yeah. But I really don't think it matters, because I mean, having worked in policy for quite a long time with government departments and ministries, in my view, the civil servants basically run most things, as you know. And in fact, if some governments, Flanders recently and also Northern Ireland, Stormont, didn't have a government for a while, for a couple of years. Yeah, the civil servants just ran things. So, in a sense, if we could do away with politicians, it might not be a bad thing. But I understand that. But the problem we have in Scotland now is the civil servants, the nationalist civil servants, have let us down stinking. They've not moved independence one bit, and they have the mandates. They have the mandates to do all sorts of things. They could have been negotiating withdrawal from the treaty. They could have been speaking to the UN about decolonization. They could have been doing all sorts of things. They are the government. Yeah. But the problem with a colonial administration government is its objective is to prevent independence. Yeah. We don't have a Scottish government per se. This is a UK government department still in Scotland. It's what the French call a department. Yeah. You know that. Yeah, sure. So we have a department here, just like you have in Martinique or Reunion. Yeah. In Scotland, it's a department of Westminster. That's basically all it is.
Because we have regions and then we have departments. Departments are the smaller. I live in I live in the department of Ille-et-Vilaine, which is among four departments within the region of Brittany. But anyway.
Well, it could be one or the other, but essentially it's not the real McCoy.
No, exactly.
But it's behaving now like in the post-colonial literature. We see the template. It's behaving in a bizarre way. But it's the mystification policies coming out, GRA and other things. These things are quite common when governments are searching for something to do, but they lose the core focus. Yeah. So the SNP have lost the core focus. Yeah, the core focus is independence, but they've discarded it. because I think they found other things they can pursue individually, but they no longer see the cause as number one.
Yeah.
A worry would be if they did get an agreement from the UK government for another referendum in a couple of years' time. I think with a local government franchise, that's probably another no result.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything you'd like to add before we say goodnight to our viewers?
Well, just this aspect about think about the colonialism thesis in the book. I'm quite used to developing theoretical frameworks, and there's a whole pile of theory there that justifies any argument that Scotland's in a kind of colonial predicament. And if that is the case, then people need to understand why that is and why they need to be independent and how that can be achieved.
Okay. Okay. On that note, we'll just say goodnight to our viewers. But thanks, Alf, for being with us again, and most enjoyable conversation as always.
Thanks, Mark. All the best.
All right.